Well, I actually got a tip earlier in the day that this was going to be happening. So I was pre-writing my story. I didn't know exactly what the charges were, but having reported and covered this story for 3 years, I had a pretty good idea. So I was pre-writing a story and then waiting for the official news to drop. So I read a story about Elizabeth in the New Yorker. It was basically a long profile of her, and there was a passage or a couple passages really that struck me as odd. But more than those passages, it was just the notion that she had dropped out of Stanford at 19, with no medical training to speak of, and gone on to revolutionize, the blood testing and created groundbreaking technology. I thought that was hard to believe. I know it happens with computers and software, but medicine is different. You usually need formal training, and scientists, who win Nobels in medicine often win them in their 60s. So after basically a career of work. But to be fair, I probably wouldn't have done anything with that if I hadn't gotten a tip a few weeks later. And the tip came from a pathologist in the Midwest who wrote a obscure blog that he called the pathology blog. BLAWG is how he spelled it. And he had read the same New Yorker story, and knowing a thing or two about blood testing, was dubious. Immediately wrote a skeptical blog item, and then was contacted by a person who had just talked to the laboratory director at Theranos, who was someone who had just left the company. And at that point, as this information eventually, I process this information, it becomes clear to me that there's a primary source out there who knows things about what's going on at Theranos and who's alleging wrongdoing. And so my mission at that point became to reach that ex laboratory director, which I eventually did. There's a cult of personality that has been developed in Silicon Valley over the past decade or two. The people like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg, the Google founders, etc. Larry Ellison, they've become these like icons, and she kind of portrayed herself following in that position. Uh, she would have been the first woman. There had been a woman tech founder who became a billionaire, and the height of her fame, 2015, Theranos was valued at 10 billion. She had managed to keep half the stock. She was worth 5 billion. So she also fulfilled this yearning that there was in the valley and beyond to have the first female billionaire tech founder. And I think those things, played into how this all happened, and how so many people let themselves basically be hoodwinked. She's been to talk to me for more than 3 years now. I tried to talk to her for 5.5 months, published my first story. So she's had plenty of opportunity to speak to me and to address my questions, and she never did. And I really don't think she dropped out of Stanford with the idea that she was going to pull this long con. I think she dropped out of Stanford truly wanting to follow in the footsteps of great entrepreneurs like Steve Jobs, and with a vision which was for this medical device, this blood testing machine. And she set out building her company and raising money, and then trying to bring her vision to fruition. And it's more of a case that, like most entrepreneurs, she encountered setbacks, and then once she encountered them, she refused to kind of acknowledge them, and go back to the drawing board and do over. And she refused to stop over promising to investors. And it got to a point when the gap between her promises and the reality of the technology got so enormous that it became a massive fraud, to use the SEC's own words. And it's a fraud that not only defrauded investors of nearly $1 billion, but that also put patients in harm's way, because she went live with her bogus technology in Walgreens stores in Northern California and Arizona. It was getting sources at first to speak to me. Everyone was terrified of the company. The company was, always threatening litigation. Its number two executive was very threatening and intimidating. He was Elizabeth Holmes's boyfriend, and was Sonny Balwani. Perhaps even more than him, the outside counsel was David Boies, the famous lawyer, feared litigator. So employees were terrified when I reached out to them, and it took me a while to get them comfortable. And the other thing later, as we got closer to publication, was dealing with Theranos' counterattack. I mean, with David Boies, they basically waged a scorched earth campaign against my story and against my sources. They pressured Tyler Schultz, the grandson of the former Secretary of State George Schultz, who was on the board, was intimidated and threatened for months after Theranos figured out that he was one of my sources. We at the paper were threatened with litigation. It just got really ugly, and that was the events. Those events were uh, I had never experienced anything like that before in 20 years of reporting. Right. Well, I didn't know at the time that he was even an investor. So when we went to press with my first story after 9 months of reporting in October of 2015, I had no clue that he was even an investor, and certainly had even less clue that she had tried to appeal to him to quash the story. I learned these things about a year later in the fall of 2016, and when I learned them from a very good source. My jaw dropped because I learned that Kurt Murdoch was not only an investor, he had invested $125 million in the company, making him the single largest investor in Theranos. And I also learned subsequently that she had met with him several times before my first story was published and had tried to persuade him to kill the story. And thankfully, he had deferred to the Wall Street Journal's editors to do the right thing, and hadn't intervened. It's definitely a cautionary tale. That's not to say that every entrepreneur and every startup in Silicon Valley is committing fraud. I like to think that most people have, these ethical boundaries that they know not to cross. I think the main lesson of the Theranos scandal is that this fake it till you make it ethos that has been embedded in the way of doing business in the Valley for 30, 40 years is not applicable to medicine and to medical products and companies that work on medical products, because when you're dealing with a medical product, eventually the end user is going to be the patient and the doctor who's treating the patient, and they're going to make very important health decisions based on your medical products, the way it performs, and you can't do vaporware medicine. I think that's, if there's any big lesson from Theranos, that's it. I go through some examples in the book. I came across more than a half dozen examples of people who got questionable results and had health scares, and had unnecessary, scans and procedures. I don't know whether someone's whether anyone died. And there's some patients who are suing the company in federal court in Arizona, alleging not only consumer fraud but also medical battery. One of them says that Theranos blood tests that he had failed to detect his heart disease, and that he went on to have a heart attack, which he claims could have been preventable. He'll have to prove those claims in court. What I do know, and what I do say at the end of the book, is that before I started digging into the company, Theranos and Walgreens were on the cusp of taking their partnership national, and of putting Theranos blood tests basically in all the other Walgreens stores. And Walgreens had 8,000 stores nationally. So you could imagine that had that happened, the chances that perhaps even someone would have died, or several people would have died, would have increased exponentially. As I wrote over the years, and as people read my book, I kept getting, emails and messages via LinkedIn and tweets from people saying they couldn't believe that she hadn't been charged. And, I kept telling people there's a criminal investigation ongoing. The wheels of justice can sometimes turn slowly. And based on what my sources were telling me, that investigation was advancing. And we have proof, today that was the case. They were hard at work on making the case, and now they've brought these indictments, and so we're now going to have a criminal trial, and if she gets if a jury convicts her and convicts her ex-boyfriend, then they're facing prison time. No, that was not my quote. That was Elizabeth's quote on Jim Cramer's Mad Money program on CNBC the night of my story. She went on his show to rebut my story, and the first thing she said was that. And so I sort of playfully tweeted